It's my pleasure to welcome Christiaan Röell, a lecturer in international business at the UNSW Business School in Sydney, Australia, Mustafa Özbilgin, a professor of organizational behavior at Brunel University, London, and Felix Arndt, a professor and the John F. Wood Chair in Entrepreneurship at the University of Guelph, Canada. Christiaan's, Mustafa's, and Felix's paper was recently published in Human Resources Management. Title is Covert Allyship, Implementing LGBT Policies in an Adversarial Context. All welcome to the interview with me, with HRM. I have several questions for you, and one of them is, why is your study important? What is the problem that led you to research this?
Of course, if you ask a group of academics why their study is important, you need time over an hour. But I'll keep it short. Our study has many implications for human resource management in multinational enterprises, but mainly our significance comes from the fact that LGBT-related work and LGBT inclusion is studied in supportive contexts where there are supportive laws, supportive discourses, and policies. In this paper, we explore a context which is antagonistic to LGBT equality in the cultural setting due to religious dogma and unsupportive laws. But even in this setting, the paper discovers something of a surprising process by which organizations multinational enterprises continue to support LGBT inclusion, their safety and well-being in the workplace. So we explore this kind of curious phenomena.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the second part of the question, but just to reiterate why it's important, I think it's important because it's a problem that kind of managers in multinational enterprises face in many parts of the world. Okay, so I collected the data over a number of years. The data was collected in Indonesia. We did a number of case studies on 12 large multinationals that are all based in Western Europe as well as the US. Now, when I conducted these interviews, and I conducted, dozens and dozens of them, one particular theme kind of came up quite often, and that was around DEI policies. DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly kind of one element of that policy, which was LGBT policies. Now, all of these companies really promoted publicly LGBT rights in their home countries and countries that have more that are more supportive. What Mustafa just talked about. Now, if it was up to these headquarters of these multinationals, they like to standardize things, right? They like to standardize their policies, their business strategies. But the problem is that the world is a heterogeneous place, okay? Every country is different. And when these investors, when these multinationals are in a place like Indonesia, but it could be many other places around the world, they have to adapt their policies. The question is, how do they do that, right? So they got a number of options. The first one, and actually the majority of the companies that we studied actually did very little, right? They gave all sorts of reasons about why they could not implement these policies, right? And it was often about upsetting governments, customers, and local communities. Some of them simply said, we don't have any of these LGBT employees in our organization. So they were kind of denying their existence, which is surprising because they had very large organizations, anywhere between 500 and 10,000 employees. And that's also surprising because the companies that did implement supportive policies for LGBT people, they all told us that many LGBT people particularly like to apply to multinationals because on their corporate websites, they are very open and very they're always promoting LGBT individuals. So that's probably not really true. Now, out of these 12 companies, we had 7 companies that did very little for the reason I just mentioned. We also had 5 companies that did actively support LGBT employees in Indonesia. And I'll tell you a little bit more about these findings. So I think one of the things that they did, they all appointed a local motivated diversity manager that kind of oversaw the different initiatives that they had. They also did awareness training, and they specifically emphasized that these awareness trainings must be adapted to the local context. It's often easier to start talking about gender diversity or human rights more broadly before you get into what's locally seen as quite controversial topics. And despite all these efforts, it still creates a lot of division within the organization, right? You have some more liberal and open and some more conservative employees. So they also mentioned it's important to have kind of clear and strict systems in place to prevent microaggressions, harassment, and even violence towards LGBT employees. Okay, so it's work in progress. I think even the companies that didn't do anything, they all often told me that we'd like to do more for these employees, but it's just very difficult in the current climate because of what Mustafa mentioned, the culture and also regulations.
Great. So my actually next question was about to ask you what you found, but you in a way already answered that. What I would like to know is what does that matter theoretically?
It matters a lot theoretically. Really, we are introducing this new concept, covert allyship, and based on what Mustafa and Christian just said, it captures a new space, essentially a space where allyship cannot be straightforward because of external conditions and maybe repression that those who exercise allyship would otherwise face. And that's interesting because that is generalizable towards all human rights context at large. And it also connects even further to maybe how human rights develop and spread, right? Because you have often phases of progress, phases of regress that change over time, and until finally these human rights issues are more comprehensively addressed. And that is a larger context where it theoretically matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point, Felix. So that's the kind of the main term we coin, covert allyship. Allyship is probably a practice that many of us and many of the listeners are familiar with. It's about how organizations and leaders support disadvantaged groups, right? But how do you do that in a context where you're very restricted and there's all these different barriers? So you have to do it very discreetly, very subtly. So I think that's kind of the core contribution. And then I think the other contribution we make is also about towards kind of the HR, international HR literature around how you implement these policies. When you cannot, implement the same policies in all your subsidiaries around the world, you must localize, you must adapt. And there were a couple of really interesting practices that they used to do that. Maybe this already I'm already getting into the last question, but one of the things these multinationals are good at is kind of organizational learning. So if, for instance, if they establish a very successful initiative in a subsidiary somewhere in the Middle East or in South America, they can actually disseminate and share these best practices with other subsidiaries around the world, so they can learn from their different sister organizations.
What do your results mean for HR policy or the practice of HR?
Thank you, Jelena. Great question. Actually, you will see from the enthusiasm that Christiaan was the one who collected the data and invited us to frame the study, and it was a great collective effort. So we should have introduced this talk with that, but let's go to the end, at least do the introduction. Thank you, Christiaan, for inviting us to this study. It has immense implications for HR policy and practice, because human resource practitioners struggle in multinational enterprises. They walk a tightrope between progress and tradition. They have what they learned from HR policy and practice from universities, which is quite progressive. It's about inclusion, it's about diversity, equality. They need to promote these ideals. But when they go to the workplaces, they hit the market conditions and also contextual aspects such as cultures and religious dogma. They struggle to reconcile these differences. And we we have data, very rich data, to show how HR practitioners in a very dire context, toxic and antagonistic context, walk this tightrope and make it possible through subtle mechanisms. Because in the West, when we study HR, we have very explicit theories of, allyship, which is loud and proud. But in this context, it won't work. It would be counterproductive. So HR practitioners need to continue doing what they do based on evidence-based HR. But they also need to recognize the local conditions and emic standards, idiosyncratic understandings of HR management. So they, in order to accommodate both an evidence-based HR in a local context, which is contrary to some of those assumptions, they need to prioritize meaning. First of all, they need to prioritize values and meaning and virtues. And one of the key virtues here is the human rights. Pierre Bourdieu talks about hysteresis, the moment between progress and tradition. We are at this moment, internationally, half of the countries have recognized equality for sexual orientation and gender identity, and half of them are struggling with it. And this moment of struggle for this group is a human rights struggle recognized by the United Nations. So HR has a role to play in this regard. And it can make a major difference if they develop strategies custom-made to fit local conditions, rather than to try and assert evidence-based strategies developed in the global north to the conditions in the global south. It won't work. We know that it won't work. But what would work? So our paper offers a lot of possibilities, theoretical possibilities, and more importantly, practical possibilities of HR practitioners getting involved in difficult decisions and difficult processes.
That's great. Thank you very much for being here and for your time. It was a pleasure to interview you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jelena.
Thank you, Jelena.